Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saviryam Karavavai Tejasvinavaditamastu Ma Vishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us. May he guide us and give us strength and right understanding. May love and harmony be with us all. Om, peace, peace, peace. And good evening. We are continuing our series of readings from Swami Abhedananda, his complete works, which are very extensive, because he lectured here in the United States for over 20 years. One of the direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. We are in his chapter on Ralph Waldo Emerson's poem, Brahm. Now you remember that Ralph Waldo Emerson was the inspiration for the Unitarian Universalist, what is now the Unitarian Universalist Church. And he had read the Bhagavad Gita at the recommendation of Carlyle, and absorbed many of those ideas. And so he's written a poem on Brahm, which means Brahman, of course. And it's interesting how the poem is so poetic that it would be difficult to understand if we didn't have Swami Abhedananda to show the references that he was using, references from the Bhagavad Gita and from the Upanishads, showing how the statements in the poem are really reflections of the things that he had read in some of these scriptures. And so we had just read that Emerson, when we study this poem of Emerson's, if we do not study it carefully, we would not be able to understand what he meant by it. It is the deepest philosophy, the highest truth that any human being can think of, can conceive of. Quote, I am the doubter and the doubt. There is a saying in the Gita, which we learn in our childhood, quote, I am the serpent that bites and I am the poison. And I am again the healer that cures the effect of the poison. It's reminiscent of the chapter in the Gita, in the fourth chapter that we repeat before meals. Brahman is the ritual. Brahman is the offering. Brahman is he who offers to the fire of Brahman. If someone sees Brahman in every action, he will find Brahman. So it's this idea that Brahman pervades everything. And this is a different concept than what you find in the Western traditions, where there's a separation from God and from the creation. In this interpretation of the world, we see that God is both immanent and transcendent. In Hinduism, we have the idea that there's an immanent God and a transcendent God. And frequently, the immanent God is thought of as mother. And so that's where we get the mother-father concept. And the Christian Scientists also picked up this idea. They also, Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science, had also studied the Bhagavad Gita, and she picked that up. And their prayers always started, they would repeat the Lord's Prayer, and when it says Our Father, then her interpretation is Our Father, Mother, God. And so we have these early people in the United States trying to sort of transform, you could say, the Christian ideas to include some of these more sophisticated philosophical ideas from the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads. So Atma here is going to continue reading from where we left off 2 weeks ago. We skipped last week, so.
It is very difficult to understand how it is possible because the dualistic minds of Christendom are trained in a different way. They think that these are the creatures and God is away from us, away from the world. But God is right here, in and through us, working through us. He's not far away. He's not sitting above the clouds, commanding from there. That's an old mythical idea. It's mythology. Emerson did not believe that. Emerson believed that God is dwelling in every individual. In fact, every soul is the tabernacle, the temple of Brahman, or the infinite absolute spirit.
All right, now we're going to take a little musical break. We're going to listen to a musical rendition of Swami Vivekananda's poem, In Nature's Beauty, which expresses this similar idea that God is in nature. So, let's see if I can turn this on. So let's continue with Swami Abhedananda.
There's a quote here.
Mm-hmm.
And I, the hymn the Brahman sings. Then we get from the 10th chapter, verse 22, I am the hymn of Samaveda. Here I'll explain to you what Samaveda is. There are 4 Vedas of the ancient Hindus. In fact, the one Veda is divided into 4 parts, which they name by different names. There are hymns. The most ancient of these hymns are recorded in the Veda called Rig Veda. Rig means hymn, Veda means knowledge, knowledge that came to them through revelation in the forms of these hymns. And when these hymns were put into music, they used to chant and sing them at the time of their ritual and ceremonial services and in sacrifice and so forth. And that particular hymn, which put into music, is called Samaveda. And all these hymns are set into music from which the post-Vedic classical music evolved. You must remember that the 7 notes of the octave also originated in India, and afterwards the Greeks got it. You give credit to the Greeks, but they do not deserve it. They got it from India. The Chinese had only 5 notes. The highest form of music, which is in perfect harmony with nature or human thought and the expression of the soul, was realized in India long before it was known in any other country. You're familiar with Wagnerian music? Wagner studied the Sanskrit science of music, which was translated into Latin. And there he got the idea of motifs. And he put those motifs in his music. That's why it's so difficult for untrained minds and untrained ears to grasp the truth of Wagnerian music. At first, when Wagner brought out this music, nobody cared for it. He went to Schopenhauer with the greatest disappointment. But Schopenhauer urged him to continue, that it was the highest music. He was also another student of the Vedas. He was the pioneer in Germany, as Ralph Waldo Emerson was the pioneer of the Vedanta teaching in America. Samaveda is still sung and chanted in India by the priests and the scholars. They're more like Gregorian chant. So he refers to that, I am the hymn that the Brahman sings, which has been described in the Samaveda. The strong gods pine for my abode, and pine in vain the sacred seven. This idea we find in the 10th chapter, verse 2. The Devas, the bright gods, do not know this absolute. And also in the 11th chapter, verse 52, we read, even the Devas, bright spirits, are panting to see this divine manifestation.
And of course, music is a wonderful metaphor for the whole creation. And not only are there 7-note scales, but of course in the Western music you have 12 diatonic notes, and in Indian music you even have more. You have quarter tones. And those are all based on the harmonic series of a note. If you take one note and you keep multiplying that fundamental note, you get first the octave, and then the fifth, and then another octave, and then the third note of the scale, and so forth. And so depending on how many overtones you look at and then translate down those overtones into the first octave, you can get 7-note scales, 12-note scales, and even more. So it's all based on the one being multiplied. And so that's a wonderful metaphor for how the one can become the many. The one fundamental note, when multiplied through its overtone series and then translated down into a hearable range, you end up with the entire scale. And so in that sense, the scale embodies a diversity of manifestation of the one. And it's also interesting that in order to make the scale a nice tempered scale so that you can translate songs from one key to another, we have to kind of fudge just a little bit. It doesn't come out quite right. If you take what's called the circle of fifths, you don't come out exactly at the octave. It's just a little off, and so you have to fudge a little bit. And I think that sort of represents the fact that Maya is the manifestation of Brahman, but it's not not quite the way it's supposed to be. In other words, Maya distorts things and doesn't allow us to see the absolute the way it is. It's a manifestation, but it's not a perfect manifestation. And so there's, in the terms of the three gunas, we know that tamas is the veiling power, rajas is the projecting power, and sattva is the revealing power. So something of the truth is revealed through Maya. So the essence of Brahman and its nature is revealed through all these musical tones, but it's still clouded just a little bit, even with sattva. Sattva reveals it to a great extent, but it's still veiled to some extent. It's also interesting that these scales have 7 notes, and we're going to see a little bit later in this reading that there are 7 rishis. You wonder if that symbolism has any connection. Perhaps each rishi represents a tone in the scale. You could certainly think that way for fun anyway. And of course 12 is also a number which has great symbolism, and that's a whole other lecture really, is to look at number symbolism. And of course the Pythagoreans, Plato and the Pythagoreans in the Greek tradition put great emphasis on number symbolism. And when you look at the geometric designs in Hinduism called yantras, you find a lot of geometric symbolism and number symbolism, depending on how many triangles and how many petals in the lotus and so forth. So all of that can be very interesting, which we can go into at another time. All right, let's continue now. We'll talk about how Arjuna prayed to the Lord to show a special form to him.
Arjuna prays to the Lord to show him that form which mortal eyes could stand. Then he comes down again to this plane of sense consciousness. Then he says that even the Devas, bright gods, are panting to see, struggling to see that manifestation which she saw at that moment. Here the verse is very beautiful. You might like me to read the verse. Chapter 11, verse 52. The blessed Lord said, "Very hard indeed it is to see this form of mine which thou hast seen. Even the devas, the bright gods, ever long to behold this form. Neither by the Vedas, nor by austerity, nor by gifts, nor by sacrifice can I be seen as thou hast seen me." It cannot be seen by practicing austerity or by reading the scriptures. How then can it be seen? He says, "But by single devotion I may in this form be known, O Arjuna, and seen in reality, and also entered into." Therefore, love and devotion are the easiest ways by which one can attain to God realization, just as Emerson said in his essay on immortality. The soul cannot be gained by knowledge, not by manifold sciences. It can be obtained by the soul by which it is desired. It reveals its own truth. Emerson translated it by putting the word desire, but we should say by one who loves it. And that is the real meaning. One may desire, but may not have a longing strong enough to get. This truth, or eternal spirit, cannot be obtained by understanding, neither by reading the scriptures, nor by reading the commentaries, nor by intellectual effort, and not by manifold science. But he who longs for it and loves it attains to it, and to him the Spirit reveals its own nature, to none else, to none else. That's a beautiful idea.
Yes, and this, of course, also reminds us of Sri Ramakrishna's feeling that for this age, that bhakti yoga was the easiest path to follow. And so this constant devotion and love towards a chosen ideal is the easiest path. Of course, this can differ from one person to another. What's easy for one person may not be that easy for another. But that's where we have 4 yogas, and we can blend those 4 yogas in a way which allows us to follow what Swami Brahmananda used to call sahaja yoga, or the easy yoga. And so you blend the 4 yogas to create your sahaja yoga with consultation with your guru as to how to do that. And you can come up with a plan that allows you to remember the divine in whatever way is easy for you to do. And if you're following the bhakti path, it's a personal God that we're trying to remember and relate to. All right, so see how helpful it is to have Swami Abhedananda interpreting this poem, where the word desire was used instead of love. All right, so let's continue.
So the strong gods pant for my abode. The abode of the infinite is the Brahman. The sacred 7 are the 7 rishis who are described in the 10th chapter. These 7 rishis were the first teachers of mankind. They emanated from the mind of the Creator. They're described in all the scriptures as 7. In the Zendavesta, the Zoroastrian scripture, 7 are described as the 7 archangels. They are the 7 rishis described in the Bhagavad Gita. It is the spiritual hierarchy. All spiritual knowledge came from the Supreme. Vedas also came from the Supreme. Just as we breathe out the air from our lungs freely without any effort, so all the knowledge about the Supreme Spirit that human minds have received came out from the infinite Brahman, like his own breath, without any effort. And that is the revelation that can come at any time within our souls. In fact, that wind of revelation is constantly blowing around us, but we do not catch it. Our minds are too preoccupied with the things of the material world. Therefore, we cannot get any revelation or divine flash. that when we shut away all this distraction and go into the innermost self, close the door of the senses, and enter into the innermost being through prayerful attitude and perfect devotion and love, we get a glimpse of that inspiration. There we also hear the voice of the Lord, which speaks in the divine silence. But thou, meek lover of the good, find me, and turn thy back on heaven.
Yeah, so this is a good description of the meditation practice, where you close the doors of the senses and look within for the truth, trying to quiet all the waves of the mind so that the truth of your being can be revealed. As it says, the mind is often preoccupied with the things of the material world, and so we don't get any revelation or divine flash. So it's sitting in quiet. That was something the Quakers picked up too, to just sit in quiet and listening for revelation. And so this is really the essence of meditation, to be sitting in silence, to try to perceive that divine spark of revelation and catch a glimpse of that divine essence, which is our true nature. All right, so we'll continue here. Another beautiful idea. Or here we get another idea, which is very beautiful.
Here we get another idea, which is very beautiful. You know heaven is not the highest. That idea you find in the Vedas, in the Bhagavad Gita. Sri Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita that people go to heaven who enjoy only the celestial pleasure, and there they remain for a long period. But at the expiration of that period, they come down to the plane of mortals and enjoy joy and sorrow of the phenomenal world. All the heavens, from the highest heaven of the Creator down to the lower realms, are subject to rebirth and change, but the abode of the Absolute is beyond heaven. So if you aspire for that heaven, you will not be happy. Only those who understand the transitoriness of the phenomenal nature of all heaven can aspire for the unchangeable eternal truth, which is beyond all heaven. And he places Arjuna as one of those, and therefore he says, "But thou meek lover of the good, find me, and turn thy back on heaven."
Yeah, it seems to me I remember there was a Twilight Zone episode where somebody dies and goes, and there's this very pleasant experience. Everything seems just lovely. He can have whatever he wants. But after a while, he gets bored. And he says, this heaven stuff is really boring. I think I might want to try the other place. And he says, "Where do you think you are?" So sometimes we think that the things we want are all these nice things and everything comes easily and so forth, but actually that would become extremely boring and probably not what we expected. If you had to have nothing but desserts to eat, you would pretty soon get really sick of it. So this is the idea that these heavens are really not the be-all and end-all. There's another story where Sita asks Rama, why don't we just take away all the suffering here and make things easy for people and have things all nice and easy? And so Rama does this, and then pretty soon they find that doesn't work at all. And she says, "It's okay, go back to the way it was." So we find that this idea of eternal heaven is really not a workable idea. All right, let's continue here.
Do not care for it anymore. There are many heavens, according to the Gita. And why should there not be many heavens? Do you think the Christian heaven includes all ideas of human mind? No, it is only playing on the harp. That's one thing, and people may not like to do it. Some may rather get tired of it. Some hope for the Mohammedan heaven, where there are celestial beings and wine. I think that in the land of prohibition, it would be very desirable to go to Mohammedan heaven, where these celestial beings are pouring wine
into the cups. Are you missing it?
into the cups of the pious souls who are sitting under shade of the trees, where rivers of milk and honey are flowing at their feet. That's more attractive. Then there are other heavens. Think of musicians. They would not care to go to listen to playing on the harp, especially modern musicians. They would rather like jazz music, and that would be their ideal.
Yeah, you know, when you see somebody playing the harp, it looks actually it does really look kind of celestial. You know, they're just strumming away and all this beautiful music comes out. For some reason, I was fortunate to have 3 friends that played the harp in school. I think that's got to be unusual to have 3 people in your immediate classes just before and after and the one you're in to actually play the harp. One of them is still the harp teacher at UCLA. But I got to try it once, and it's not at all easy. Those strings are really hard to pluck. You don't just go strum, strum, strum. It's just cling, 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 cling. It's a lot of hard work. So if your goal is to go to heaven and play a harp, I hope it's a lot easier than the actual harps we have down here. All right, so let's continue.
Then there are the painter's heaven, the heaven of the artists, the heaven of the poets, and the heaven of the dancers. But I do not know if the modern dancers should be allowed there. Why, they have very little clothes, you know. So there may be any heavens. In fact, all the heavens are creations of the human mind. All that we hold dear to our hearts and wish to enjoy for a long period without any cessation or break, we regard that as heaven. With that idea, we pass out of the body, and naturally we are drawn to it, because thoughts are realities of things. For instance, when you pass out of the body, if you have a desire to drink a cup of coffee, the very thought of a cup of coffee will bring unto you the cup of coffee. The very thought of drinking will produce that delicious taste and enjoyment. There you do not have to light the gas stove and brew the coffee and then wash the pot. All this trouble you do not have in heaven. The very thought of a cup of coffee will bring the coffee, and you will enjoy it. So thoughts are things and realities, as I have said before. Now can you imagine the state? Yes, you ought to imagine, because in a dream you may have all the pleasures. When you do not have a physical body, you do not have to go through all this drudgery and trouble and physical action. But you must remember that you are the creator, and you can create everything by your imagination. And so you must not think yourself as a slave to the creator and also to creation, but you are also part of the creator. That is one of the grand ideas we learn from the scriptures. That we never be despondent, never feel discouraged, and never feel that we are going to eternal damnation after death. There are some people who have become so degenerate in their thoughts that they are born in sin and iniquity, that they cannot think that they are divine. They're rather frightened to think of it. They say, "How dare you say such a thing? We are gods, or we are divine." It's an absolute blasphemy. Think of the degeneration that have been caused by long-standing superstition that we are born sinners. We have inherited sin from the first man, and we are suffering and bound to remain as a sinner all through eternity. This very thought is a blasphemy. A child of God must have his birthright of divine manifestation instead of suffering eternally for the sin that was committed by the first man or his grandparents or some ancestor. All sins are nothing but errors or mistakes. And the moment the light of knowledge dawns, the sins vanish. Sins are burned up by divine flash of the supreme light. As a spark of fire will burn up a huge mountain of cotton wool in a moment, so the sins of hundreds of generations, which may appear like a mountain, will be burned up in no time by the fire of divine knowledge. Therefore, we must search for that divine knowledge.
Yes, so This is, of course, a wonderfully uplifting idea of the Hindu Vedanta philosophy that I think really speaks to that divinity of the soul, the eternal divinity of the soul, that and this idea of being a sinner and so forth is really an error, that we should concentrate on our divine nature. Then the earlier things about the idea of heavens not being the ultimate reminded me of another story. This one comes from one of the Gilbert and Sullivan operettas. There's one operetta where there's this grumpy old man that just loves to complain about everything. And so in order to torture them, he's captured by this other kingdom whom he's supposed to marry as princess to one of the people of this kingdom, and she doesn't want to marry him because she thinks she wants to start this university. So anyway, so they capture this grumpy old king, and in order to torture them, they give him everything he wants. And so he sings this little song, "Don't the days seem lank and long when everything's right and nothing goes wrong? Don't the days seem dull and flat when there's absolutely nothing to grumble at?" He was just miserable because he had nothing to grumble about. So these are some of the strange ideas that we come up with. Sometimes there are people that just absolutely have to have something to complain about, or they're not happy. And so their idea of heaven must be very different than these other ideas. All right, so let's continue. We only have a few more paragraphs, so let's keep going.
That is the inspiration that inspired Emerson, and therefore he tried to express it so wonderfully and so beautifully. There it gives you a chance to think that you are the creator of your own destiny, that by your own thoughts and deeds, you can be better than you are today, and you are not slave. You are not bound hand and foot by the decree of destiny, that you are to suffer and just wait for somebody to help you and to give you salvation. No, you are the savior of yourself, and that idea is given here too. You must raise yourself by yourself, because your own self is your best friend, and your own self can be your worst enemy.
Yeah, you know, that's reminds me of something I used to do when I was teaching. I used to be a math and science teacher, and sometimes you'd have a student that was struggling, you'd help them after school or something. And so to encourage them, I would always say, just try to be a little better today than you were yesterday. You don't have to compare yourself to anybody else, to the other people in your class, and sometimes it would be someone who had siblings that were, perhaps much higher achievers than they were. And you could tell that this kind of weighed on them. All the teachers expected them to be like their brother or sister that was in the class a couple years ahead of them. And I said, don't worry about anybody else. Just be yourself and try to be a little bit better today than you were yesterday. And I think that's a very nice way for all of us to try to live. We don't have to look at some unattainable perfection that's so far out there you feel like you're never going to get there. You just have to look one day at a time, one step at a time, and going forward that way. And taking things little by little, we can make progress. That's the important thing, is to keep our spirits up and to make progress. So let's see, where were we here? Yeah, I think looking back at the, I've been associated with this center for how many years now? 67 years, almost 68 years. I've seen a lot of changes, but I would say that in the early days, there was no immigration really from India, so everybody came here pretty much from a Judeo-Christian background. And the two main reasons I think people came to Vedanta was, one, it had a technology for improving your spiritual life, some method other than just belief in a doctrine for you to improve spiritually, and this idea that you were not a sinner, that your divine nature was your true nature. And I think those were the two primary reasons that people found Vedanta philosophy attractive. All right, so let's continue here.
You must raise yourself by yourself, because your own self is your best friend, and your own self can be your worst enemy. And therefore, if you aspire for the highest, you will attain to the highest. And if we think that we're sinners, we will become more sinful, and we will suffer, and will be degenerate. There runs a proverb, what thou thinkest, thou shalt become. Emerson studied the Gita and also the other scriptures. When I was with Mr. Malloy, as I spoke to you at the beginning of my talk, who was the president of the Emerson Club in Boston, he took me to Emerson's home. There I saw his valuable library. It was kept by his sister just as it was in his lifetime. I saw he had a volume of the laws of Manu. Manu was the lawgiver of ancient India. Your most wonderful laws you will find. You will find the laws of Moses are just like imitations. Moses lived about 1,400 years before Christ. Sri Krishna was older than Moses. The Gita was older than the time of Moses. And Manu was the first man of this cycle as the first lawgiver. He was much older. There you will find that all the best laws that were given to the tribes of Israel by Moses were anticipated by the great lawgiver, Manu. Naturally, Emerson got inspiration from the lawgiver. He had also in his library the Vishnu Purana, which describes the life of Sri Krishna, and he had the Upanishads, which were translated into Latin and afterwards into other languages. I saw all those, and I was very much impressed. I saw a letter which Carlyle wrote to Emerson. In that letter, he mentioned about the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita, the Song Celestial. Therefore, Ralph Waldo Emerson, understanding the spirit of the Gita, made a free rendering of some of the passages, and he immortalized the Gita by his poem on Brahm. The moment you study this, you will be lifted up in a different realm to the oneness of the Spirit. Emerson says, just as Vedanta says, there's one mind, one spirit, one being, one truth, and one reality. That one is called by different names. As we read in the Rig Veda, the oldest scriptures in the world, that which exists as one, men call it by various names. This is the eternal truth. And from the truth we have come into existence. In truth we live, and into the truth we return after the death of the body. This is the philosophy of Vedanta, and this was expressed by that beautiful poem on Brahm by Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Yes, and you know, I set the Chandi to music a little over a year ago, and in going through that in detail, I realized how many of the sentiments expressed in the Chandi, which is the Devi Mahatmyam, the great poem of the Shakta tradition, which is sometimes compared to the Gita. It's sort of the similar scripture for the Shakta tradition. You find the same kinds of philosophy being described, but simply in terms of the mother instead of Brahman. And so it's interesting that these things all interrelate. So we don't have too much time yet, so I think rather than beginning a new chapter, we'll listen to another song. This one is How Beautiful the Flowers, again from Vivekananda. If I can find it, let's see if I can find it. I have to cue it up. Yes, okay. So the essence there is, again, there's when you have this philosophy that Brahman pervades all things, you have to also realize that Brahman is pervading not only the beautiful flowers, but the terrible storms and everything else. And so the idea is to see God behind everything, it says, and then the whole thing changes, and you become the witness and realize that it's God's play permeating the entire creation. And this brings about a change, a complete change in your viewpoint. You see things differently, and you can then take the attitude of an actor in a drama. You've been given a role, and you play that role out, but you can be detached from it, just as when an actor walks off the stage, they no longer have to put on an act. So this is the essence of this teaching, that try to see God in everything, in every being and in every action. And through that you will find Brahman. So let's close with a chant. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see. Filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman all, yet is it still the same. Om, peace, peace, peace. And we'll see you next week.